Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of The Source. Today we have a very special guest. Special guest, tell us, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, Jim, I really appreciate you having me on here. My name is Nick Batista. I am the Director of Sales for Software Resources. SRI is a technical staffing agency, so nationally we place different roles in technology on a contract, direct hire, contract to hire basis. Pretty plugged in with the labor market, so that's an area of passion of mine, and I'm really excited to share a little bit about that today.
Yes. I appreciate that. We met at the Atlanta Recruiting Community event,
Yeah.
and last month talking, and we talked. You talked a lot about the labor market and showed a lot of data, and that spurred a lot of conversation because
Yes.
everyone's sort of like, what is going on in this economy? So I appreciate you coming on The Source and sharing some of that data with us. I'll start off by this. What is going on with the economy?
That's a complex question, right?
Yeah,
So a lot of the data that I've been looking at and that we presented at that event was specific to the labor market. We had some more general data on like GDP, inflation, unemployment rates.
right.
I think at a big picture, because we started it off saying, hey, how do people feel, right? Like, can you give me a word from just kind of the community? And we heard words like challenging. We heard words like uncertain, confusing, and it's not a
Yeah,
secret, right, that this is a challenging economy and especially challenging to understand. Since 2020, the data kind of shows as well we're not following regular trend lines. We had, the pandemic event, which changed everything. It was kind of a blip in time that was different than normal. The recovery from that pandemic, which was really accelerating growth, accelerating hiring, and then now we're kind of past that era to where things are returning to a baseline. So, um, kind of in a short term, how can I say what's the economy doing? It's cooling off and returning to more of a normal trend line is what most of the data is showing.
hmm. Okay.
Um, I think the main analogy that we used was we were sort of in a hot tub for an economy, like things were boiling, companies were hiring, expanding, debt was cheap, money was cheap. It was easy for them to invest, and then in a high rate environment with runaway inflation, some of those actions caused things to not be so hot, but not to be so bad. But jumping from a hot tub into a swimming pool kind of feels like you're off the Titanic and you're on that little plank in the Antarctic Ocean, right? Like it's a little cold, but realistically, it's not too much worse than it was before. You're just kind of feeling that contraction and that reset right now, especially in the labor economy and especially in technology.
Hmm. 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 Well, I think the word I would use for it all is interesting.
Yeah.
I think it sort of captures the whole essence of things. I know you shared some charts there that were quite provocative. Could you share some of those charts with us now?
Of course. Yeah, I got so here we
Show me
are.
the data.
Show me the money, but on a macro scale, right?
Yeah.
Where's the beef? So yeah, I mean, some of this data is pretty interesting. So I think a lot of people hear these as buzzwords, right? Or they read them in LinkedIn articles and they're like, "Cool, why should I care?" I
Yeah.
think that the name of the session we did at ARC, the Atlanta Recruiter Meetup, was WTF is happening, and it's kind of like WTF does this mean to me, right? Like, how
Mm,
can I use this? I think what's really important to understand when you're talking about things like GDP and unemployment rate and inflation are these are sort of the macroeconomic trend lines that are influencing your daily life. So these are the reasons, the man behind the curtain, kind of.
yeah.
Um, GDP is just really a measure of how productive the economy is. So what you see in the left column here is the U.S. GDP going from Q4 2022 until Q1 2024. And at the time of giving this presentation and making these slides, I don't have Q2 data. Um, we did just get that actually interesting today. I was reading an article on it that Q2 inflate or GDP was much stronger than expected. So that's a good sign. Like overall, we were economists in general were expecting GDP to stay around the same at that 1.4%, but it's actually at 2.8%. There's been
Hmm.
signs of consumer spending. So GDP being sort of a lagging indicator for job growth. That's good news that we may be looking to kind of return to a more normal hiring market as we enter into the later parts of this year or maybe early next year. But at least we're getting positive news on that front that the economy is a little bit more productive. Businesses are, moving. They're investing, buying services. People are selling things. There's action sort of happening, and that's what GDP captures. Um, Unemployment rate's sort of self-explanatory, right? So, although it historically pretty low, it's higher than it was. And I think that as if we talk about it a little bit later for later slides in this presentation, you're really just feeling it in different areas that traditionally have been really, really strong from an employment standpoint. Things like business services and consulting, things like information technology, where unemployment's been as low as 1.6 or 1.8%, are now trending more toward like 3.1%, which is still lower than the 4% or 4.1% general economy. But those types of folks aren't really used to being unemployed. Like there's been such a high demand for so long that it's kind of confusing. Those were like the gold mine professions, right? That if you can go ahead and you can go get an engineering degree, or you can build really strong connections from a business standpoint, you probably won't want for employment, and you're going to be able to secure, both employment and a high wage. And we're seeing that start to be a little bit less effective as it has been in the past.
I'm always a bit skeptical when I see unemployment rate numbers, especially during a presidential election year. Um, the skeptical side of me says they're going to do all they can to make things look wonderful.
Mhm.
Because I see this low unemployment rate, but at the same time I see so many layoffs. I see so many layoffs, so many people looking, so many people overworked because companies aren't hiring, even though they're posting all these ghost jobs.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, it doesn't feel like this chart is showing. It's like two different worlds. Um, I'm wondering if a lot of these factors that are going into this unemployment rate are they really jobs? I mean, how are they counting them? Is this like government jobs bringing that number low? Is it the government not counting certain people to give it this low number? I just feel like it's fun. They're having fun with numbers when I see this unemployment rate. What do you think of that?
So, I mean, unemployment rate has a few different factors in the way it's calculated. I think that one of the things that might throw off that perception a little bit, or at least throw off the way the data is calculated, is that when people have been unemployed for so long that they are given up and they're no longer looking for work, they're sometimes not included in that rate. And some fields have been kind of under duress for long enough that there are people that have been laid off and unemployed for over a year, right? Especially if you're working in recruiting or in tech, where I think they've been kind of impacted the hardest by those layoffs that you mentioned.
Yeah.
That throws some of that off. I think it's also important to mention that the unemployment rate and the GDP data, like all of these types of data, are tracking at the entire economy level, and it includes government numbers as well. Um, so there's been, alongside sort of a contraction in private spending, and by private I mean non-government entities, and a contraction in private employment, there's a good amount of investment on the public side of the house. Like there's a good amount of budget still rolling into state governments, local governments, federal government funding, and that's supporting some of this number too. The other part of it is like there's a little bit of a black hole on some of this data, right? Like we can just pool it and trust it to the amount that we trust it. Um, Obviously, there's always a different story, and macroeconomic data doesn't invalidate maybe the feelings or the personal stories of people that have found themselves unemployed during this time. It also doesn't show how hard it is necessarily to get hired, even if a lot of people are employed on a historical like from a historical standpoint. It doesn't mean that it's easy for those that are unemployed to then gain employment. And I think we see that in some other data and other slides when we look at hiring rate as well. So the JOLTS report will give the JOLTS report gives some more clarity into the rate of hiring and the rate of job openings. So the rate of like actual hiring, people getting new jobs, shows maybe a little bit more on how easy it is to get your next role if you find yourself unemployed. Yeah, and mentioning that 28% of people in the tech layoffs, we actually have some stats and some slides on that on the screen. Yeah, given there's not a lot of public data around this, but there was a company, data science firm, 365 Data Science, that did a survey of the big tech workers, and in that, they found that, yeah, 28% were in HR talent sourcing. And we remember that the recruiters were the first ones to get hit in the first waves. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, a lot of times weren't spared in the further waves either. They kept getting sort of drilled with that. Um, you see it in software engineering, some other fields as well. But I mean, I think it's interesting that HR and talent sourcing was almost as impacted as the others category. That's not captured here, right? So
Ouch. Ouch.
when you look at this, I mean, a lot of recruiters were put onto the market from these
Yeah.
layoffs and these events, and there's some other stats on here as well that are demographic based, and I think the gist of the demographics is that these end up being people that are sort of in the prime of their career. They're
Yeah.
usually a little bit more expensive, and we've seen that trend of companies when times get a little tough, they'll get rid of maybe their more experienced recruiting staff and then turn to more either junior employees, or they'll supplement with technology or supplement by moving labor to a cheaper area offshore or near shore. So um, just as that happens in software engineering, it happens in recruiting and sourcing as well, and it's something we're dealing with.
Tell me about this inflation rate here, because I see it rising, then I see it drop, um, then I see it inch up a little bit. And that's interesting to me because when I'm in the grocery store and I see these prices and I see the shrinking bags or the shrinking boxes
Shrinkflation.
on cereal, yeah, I'm like, okay, the price may not be as much, but the box that I'm buying is a lot thinner. So, I think the inflation rate also was a little bit higher than what it seems. Am I right in that, or what do you think about that?
So I think that the inflation rate is accurate, but what you're speaking to, and what a lot of people, if they're not really keyed in on this, perceive around inflation is that the rate of inflation is not how much more expensive things are today than they were yesterday. It's how quickly they're getting more expensive. So
Hmm.
unfortunately, in our kind of economy, prices don't really go down again. So we're not going to see them return to lower price levels, but we have seen inflation start to slow after pretty much record highs. I mean, I'm trying to remember the time period, but essentially there was only one other time in history that inflation has been running away quite this much. But yeah, we saw really bad inflation, which is why they started raising rates to try to attack that problem. And a lot of the other negative economic consequences that we're facing now are pretty well tied to those rate raises. That makes borrowing more expensive for businesses, and then therefore kind of makes it a little harder for them to hire on that front. It makes it harder for startups to get investment, and it makes it harder for anybody to really get that free money or that near zero rate money that they were seeing before. Affects mortgages, everything else.
Sure,
But
sure.
inflation's flattening, which is the good news. We've seen that over the past few months, they haven't quite reached their target rate yet, which is closer to 2%. But we're seeing inflation at a more normal level around like 2.6%. So there's a good handle on that, which means prices should stay relatively stable. They are a lot higher, and there's other than grocers kind of walking back on some of their price jacking, and people say like corporate price gouging and stuff that happens in restaurants and grocery stores and experience based events. Those are pulling back a little bit, but they're not really resetting to pre 2023 levels.
I feel like we're getting too much into the weeds here a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, you can get me talking all day about this stuff. Yeah.
Bring me back to recruiting and sourcing, and how it's affecting how the economy is affecting recruiting and sourcing.
Yeah. So big picture, I mean, if companies have money to invest in staff, there's more of a need for recruiters and sourcers, right? So if the economy is firing on all cylinders, and consumers are buying goods, businesses are buying services, then businesses need to expand. They need to hire more people, and we saw that at a really extreme point in 2022 and in 2021 post pandemic, to where they need to hire staff. They need more people to support those operations. And when the rates were as low as they were, they could invest in that fairly easily. However, now with rates being high, consumer spending being okay but a little bit down, they don't have quite as much money to invest in that growth, and they still need to protect the profit margin. So staff, being their largest fixed cost on almost any balance sheet, is usually the first to get scrutinized. That's where they're going to make cuts if they need to reduce expenses, and it's what they're going to watch really closely from a budget standpoint, and probably not hire quite as much if they're trying to make sure they're profitable in the face of lower demand. All that to be said, right now it's a little bit tougher in recruiting and sourcing than it typically would be. It's not the end of the world by any means, but it's certainly harder than it was a couple of years ago, and still seemingly a little bit tougher in that industry than it was pre-pandemic.
I remember from your talk how you pointed out that depending on which industry you serve, you definitely were feeling the pain of the recession. But if you were working in other fields, maybe not so much. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course, yeah. And I'm going to navigate to some other slides for that because there's some really good data from ADP, and we can go back to JOLTS if we'd like to later to show sort of hiring rates. But if we look at industry insights from ADP, just background on anybody that wants these reports, you can just Google ADP payroll reports and they publish them on a monthly basis, and it shows the private payrolls, again, private being non-government payrolls, how they're growing by business size, by sector, and a few different other metrics that can give you more insight. And this is where I think when I talk to the audience at ARC, I called this sort of a validation slide, because a lot of people were like, you're telling me things are all right, but it feels a lot worse than it is, right? So why do I feel that way if on a larger scale? And every article I read is telling me things are pretty much all right. This is where I like to look for that. So like I said earlier, certain industries that you would typically think are always going to do really well have faced a little bit of a contraction from a hiring standpoint. So it's softer in, let's say, information, right? Job growth is a little bit down. And that continued from May to June. We're sort of kind of seeing a little bit of recovery there, but it's still down. Professional and business services have ticked up a little bit as we head into the summer and more spend is sort of unleashed. Although throughout, if we had the prior month's data, that's been down for a few months as well. And when you think of these industries, these are typically your white collar industries, like a professional and business services is going to be consulting companies, accounting companies, right? Anything that offers a professional service. And then, or as well as staffing agencies, like my own industry. And then information could be tech companies or data providers that work in those fields. Those are down a little bit. And then on the contrast, a lot of our job growth and our job creation that we're seeing, the things that are keeping that unemployment rate relatively low and keeping some of that economic output positive, are in fields that we don't necessarily consider high paying, right? Or white collar a lot of times. And a lot of recruiting professionals, at least in Atlanta, aren't always gravitated toward that field. So construction, there's a little bit of a construction jobs boom in that area as there's more construction going on across the US. That's not necessarily within the the accountants and the software developers for construction companies, but like the boots on the ground people working, project managers and superintendents and even reps that are out selling construction products. And we see the same in trade, transportation, utilities. Obviously, hospitality and retail, as we head into the summer, has experienced a bit of a boom because they have some seasonal hiring, and this data specifically is not seasonally adjusted. I tend to go a little bit too deep into some of it, but the big point is that in some areas, it feels almost like it's a recession from a hiring standpoint if you've been in it, and it's lasted quite a long time. Because as long as the rates have been held high and for long, those industries that are feeling ill effects continue to feel them, and they're just kind of trying to play to stay flat. They're trying to make it through to the other side. Other fields are doing fine. So they don't feel it. Like if it's not happening to you, it's not happening to you in that case.
Yeah, when I look at this chart, and remember from the earlier talk, if a recruiter or sourcer or anyone in TA for that matter, is looking for a new opportunity,
Mhm.
it might be intimidating to switch from one industry to another. But according to these numbers, it's more safety from a financial standpoint, um, if you're going to go from one field to the other, because there's growth in those areas. So you'll be able to have your job longer if you go to, say, construction industry, for example, or maybe education, because that's
Yeah.
consistent growth there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in recruiting, your profession is very market dependent, right? It's as cyclical as the market itself because recruiters are great at finding, hiring and retaining staff. They're really needed for that. But when companies aren't so worried about, when they're laying people off and they're not hiring, and they're not so worried about those, recruiters are usually the first to go, just because they're not going to invest in that a lot of times to people that are made to help grow the company when the company is not growing. So I agree. If you align yourself to a growing industry and you stay plugged into the data, not only will you probably have a better chance at finding open positions as a recruiter and a sourcer, but once you land in one of those positions, there will be more of a need for your role. So the role itself will be a little more stable because you'll have more positions to source and recruit on, more ways to prove your success, and more ways to really become irreplaceable within that business process.
Yeah, we are running short on time. What's another key point you would like to share before we close?
I think, from a recruiting and a sourcing standpoint, and I've got a bunch of other stuff, and time is a constraint. Um, just keeping with it, like understanding and remembering that the economy and especially the recruiting market is cyclical, and always kind of turns back one way or
Sure.
another.
Yeah.
And working to develop your skills, continuing to network, looking into the data and aligning yourself with the quote unquote winning teams or winning industries is always going to be helpful. And there are other slides and information that did studies in the big tech layoffs, and we found that up to 28% of the people that were laid off were in recruiting and sourcing. So
Mm.
they were in big tech, some of the highest impacted groups alongside marketing and software engineering. And they're also the first profession to grow when things bounce back. So keep your skills sharp, stay on top of the data, become an expert in these sorts of things. Because if you understand from a larger level how the economy is flowing and how that affects your job, you'll be able to educate your hiring managers. You'll be able to educate, your candidates. You'll really shine in interviews, and then you'll also be more prepared as a recruiting professional to follow the money, right, and to follow the trends and put yourself in a really good position. So stay with it, educate yourself on these things. And although for a lot of recruiters right now, some are doing great, right? But for a lot of them that
Yeah.
happen to find themselves in a layoff situation or less than ideal situation, I think just remembering that it is cyclical and that just 2 years ago was the best time ever to be a recruiter, especially in tech, right? And now we're here. Give it another 2 years, we'll probably be back to something a little more normal.
Yeah. It's good to keep your skills up because the market
Absolutely.
will return back.
That's what makes you, as a recruiter, makes you valuable. Aside from your relationships and your ability to like help people and work with people, your skill is a hard skill. It's not all soft skills in recruiting. It's you understand how to work with candidates through the hiring process, how to attract them, how to make sure they're happy, retain them, how to onboard properly, and then how to understand things like this data on this screen to help advise companies, from the inside on how to effectively hire and then target hiring for staff.
If somebody wanted to reach out to you and network with you further, how can they find you online?
Yeah, plenty of ways to get in touch with me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Nick Batista on LinkedIn, or you can connect with me at my email at Software Resources. It's the letter N, Batista at softwareresources.com, or through our company website. I'm available through those contact links as well at softwareresources.com. And then, if you want to network, talk about labor data, anything like that, I'm open to it. And obviously, that's what I do as a living. If you need help finding technical talent, then I'm happy to help with that as well, or share some data that might help you as you sort of draft your own hiring strategy internally.
Nick Batista, thank you so much for your time on The Source. You are appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. It was a great time.
AI. So many tools, so little time. What's a sourcer to do but stay informed? And one way to do that is SourceCon's AI Product Showcase. This is a very unique opportunity. Sponsors present for 5 minutes and then have 5 minutes to demonstrate live to in-person and virtual attendees how their product can solve a real-world sourcing scenario. Only a select few AI products will be featured on the main stage, so if anyone wants to share their AI product with the SourceCon community, reach out to sales@ere.net today. SourceCon community. The AI Showcase is a showcase you didn't know you needed. Always remember, SourceCon loves you.